In this video, I'll be taking you through how I set up my brand new Fujifilm X-T5. Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. In this video I'll be taking you through how I like to set up a new X-T camera, and in this case the X-T5. So when I got my GFX 100S I made a similar video to this and it seemed to resonate with quite a few people, so I've decided to make one for the X-T5 as well in the hopes that it will be helpful to some of you. So I actually tried to make this video a couple of weeks ago when my first X-T5 arrived, but the menus were significantly different from previous models and it took me a little getting used to. I got a bit lost in the menus there, and then I found out that that X-T5 was actually dead on arrival and I had to get a replacement. So this time around we'll be filming on one X-T5 and setting up the second one. As with the GFX video, I won't be running through every single menu item as that would just take far too long, and the vast majority of the different items in the menu aren't really that important to my work and the way that I like to use the camera. So in the beginning I'll explain to you how I plan to use the camera and what sorts of things that I might like to set up, and then we'll go through and find those items and talk about each one as it pops up. When setting up my X-T cameras, I'm coming from a place of, this is my work camera. So for the vast majority of my work, I'm going to be doing family photography, engagement or pre-wedding photography, and corporate event photography. Now, I approach each of these in a very similar way with similar settings and only need to really make small changes to move from one type of shooting to the next, and then a few small changes with each scene that I'm shooting as well. And so I like to have my cameras set up so that I can basically do this in the most efficient way possible. Now, to that end, I like to have my most frequently changed items on the different function buttons that are scattered around the body, and then have anything that's, that doesn't fit on those spill over into the quick menu for easy access. And by setting up the camera this way, I rarely, if ever, see the menu system of the camera after my initial setup. So without further ado, let's jump into how I do that. And the first thing I noticed with the X-T5 is that pieces of the video menu have made their way back into the stills menu, and sort of unlike the X-T4, which kept them completely separate. Now, I'll save my rant about that for my full review, but it seems like Fujifilm is doing their usual 2 steps forward, 1 step back when it comes to creating a camera that's very, very easy to use. Now, the next thing of note is that there is a network and USB settings menu, which has a lot of options related to USB and different wireless connectivity, and why these options aren't just simply in a submenu within the setup menu is beyond me. But again, let's keep that for the review and dive into the settings that I actually make use of on my X-T cameras. Whenever I get a new camera, I like to start from the top of the menu and work my way down item by item all the way to the bottom, just to ensure that I don't miss anything and everything is set up the way that I like it. And thankfully, Fujifilm puts the one setting that I always change right at the top for us. So jumping into the image quality menu, I set the camera to RAW, and then in the RAW recording menu, I set it to lossless compressed. This way I get the full image quality of the camera, but slightly smaller files. So it might take up a little more processing power from both the camera and the computer to deal with the compression and decompression, but I'm able to get more files on my memory card at any given shoot, and I can save space when I come back to back up those files later on. The next thing I'll do is set my film simulation to classic Chrome. Now this is my default and sort of my most commonly used film simulation, and it gives me a good idea in the viewfinder of how my finished files are going to look sort of most of the time. Now, occasionally in a high dynamic range scene, I'll use a Turner, or if I'm planning on converting to black and white anyway, I'll switch into one of the Acros modes just so that I can get a preview of what black and white might look like. But we'll get to sort of how I change those later on. And it really doesn't matter anyway, since I'm shooting RAW, so when I get those files back onto the computer, I'm always able to change the film simulation or just discard it completely if I want to. Now, I'll skip over all of the effect settings because I don't shoot JPEG, so I don't need to change sharpness and tonality in camera. I'd much rather have fine control over those in post-production anyway. So my next setting is going to be white balance. Now, despite Fujifilm's claims that its new AI-based auto white balance does a great job, I still prefer to have my white balance exactly the same for all the images in a given set. So I still use a manual setting, and most of the time I'm going to be working in natural light, so that is going to be sunny white balance. balance. So in the menu, I will always set sunny as my default, and then I'll have a button, which we'll talk about later, for being able to change the white balance when I need to. And the final setting that I'll change here is long exposure noise reduction. And basically, this will tell the camera to make 2 separate exposures whenever the shutter speed goes beyond, I believe it's 1 second. And so the first exposure will be the scene that you're actually photographing, and then the second will be made with the shutter curtains closed, just to be able to take a dark frame with the exact noise pattern for that particular scene, you know, the heat of the sensor and all of that sort of thing, which it will then subtract from the existing image to be able to give you a really clean, noise-free image. Now, I would rather not wait an extra 60 seconds when I make a 60-second exposure, and I would also like to have more fine control over noise reduction in post-production anyway, so I will turn this off. Okay, so into the focus menu. Now, firstly, I'll set my AF mode to single point. This is where I do the vast majority of my shooting. I just like to move around a single point, put it on what I'm going to be focusing on, and then focus the camera and take my shot. So I do also change this pretty frequently throughout my couple sessions and my family sessions, and so I will assign this to a button later on in this guide. The next thing that I change in here is release focus priority. Now, this basically tells the camera to either release the shutter regardless of whether it can confirm focus or not, or, on the other hand, to confirm focus 100% before releasing the shutter. Now, the knock-on effect of having to confirm focus every single time before you release the shutter can mean that a burst rate, so if you're shooting continuous low or continuous high, can actually slow down a little bit as the camera tries to check for focus. Now, personally, I would rather have 3 in-focus frames per second than 15 out-of-focus frames per second, so I will always set both of these to confirm the focus before releasing. So focus priority. Now, Fujifilm, for some reason, sets the AFC priority to release by default. Now, I guess they want to show off their burst modes, but I think for most people, setting this to focus priority, where it will definitely confirm that the image is in focus before releasing the shutter, is going to be a much more useful setting. The final thing that I do here is to change the touchscreen mode to off. I don't use the touchscreen for any purpose on any of my cameras, and so I always turn it off. Now, there are a couple of places where we need to switch this off, so we'll do it again later. In the user settings menu, there's nothing that I need to change, so things like time and date are set with a Bluetooth connection to my phone, so we'll skip straight to the next section. In sound settings, I'm going to turn off all of the sounds. I'm often shooting in public places or quiet corporate events and things like that, and I don't want to have my camera beeping and annoying the people around me. So I'll first turn off the self-timer beep, as the tele light flashes anyway when we have a self-timer on, so we don't really need to audibly know that it's counting down. Now, I'll also turn off the electronic shutter volume, as I'd rather not have an awful fake shutter sound when I'm using the electronic shutter. You know, it's a surefire way to ruin the peaceful mood around a sunset shoot or something like that for everybody around you. In the screen settings, there is one new setting here that I am extremely happy about, and that is that we can now set the electronic level to 3D by default. That'll free up one of the custom buttons that I've been using for that for years, so thank you, Fujifilm. Now, next is to go into the display custom setting and check all of the things that I'd like to have in the viewfinder while I'm shooting. So here we're going to skip the first few items. Focus frame and focus indicator, it's good to have those, that way you know where the camera is going to focus and if it has achieved focus. The AF distance indicator, don't really need that on. The camera will focus for itself and we can usually tell if it's in or out of focus. Now the manual focus distance indicator, that's kind of useful because it also gives you the depth of field indication when you're manual focusing, so kind of useful. Histogram, we'll also turn that one on. I like to have the histogram on as I'm shooting. The next thing would be the live view highlight alert, which I also like to have on. It just basically flashes in the viewfinder when things are blown out, so that you know you're blowing out a sky or blowing out skin or blowing out somebody's white t-shirt or something like that. Shooting mode, don't really need that in the viewfinder. I know what I'm on. Aperture shutter speed and ISO, good things to be able to see through the viewfinder. Next things are exposure compensation. We can turn both of those off. We don't really need to know. We're basically using exposure compensation to make the image brighter or darker. It doesn't really matter what the number is. The next thing, focus mode. Always good to know if maybe you've knocked it into manual focus just very quickly. Photometry mode, I very rarely ever change that, so I'm just going to turn that off. I don't really need to see it in the viewfinder. Shutter type, that's good to have in the viewfinder because we can then know if we're using electronic or mechanical shutter very quickly without having to take a frame. Flash, we'll leave that on. Having the flash mode in the viewfinder can be useful. Continuous mode, another good one. If you look through the viewfinder and you notice that you're on continuous high, you can find out before you press the shutter in and release 15 frames. The dual IOS mode, very useful to have that in there because you know when you've turned off the image stabilization, it'll have a little hand in there with a line through it saying, hey, you might get some shakies. So that's a useful one. Touchscreen mode, I'm going to turn that off because I don't use the touchscreen, so I don't need to know if it's on or off. White balance, don't really need that displayed in there. I can usually tell if I've got it on tungsten and I'm out in the daylight because everything will be blue. Film simulation, really not useful to be in the viewfinder, don't need to have that in there. Dynamic range, never really going to change that off 100 as I don't really use it in my style of shooting. Boost mode, never going to turn that off of boost, so I don't really need that. Frames remaining, that's useful. Knowing how many images are left on your memory card is a very, very helpful thing. As you can probably see from all of these items here, I'm basically trying to declutter my viewfinder and have this as simple an experience as I possibly can. Just have the things that I really need while I'm working. Image size and quality. Never really going to have this off RAW, so not really useful to me again. Movie mode and record time. I'm never really shooting video unless I'm doing these YouTube videos, and so I will have that off. Digital teleconverter. I'm not going to use a digital teleconverter. I will just crop in post. Let's turn that off. Communication status. Don't really need to know that my phone is connected because I don't geotag my images. The only time I ever use the phone connection is when I might want to quickly transfer a JPEG, so I'll know if that's connected. Microphone level, again, the only time I will ever use that is if I'm shooting a YouTube video, so I will quickly turn it on while I'm in video mode on the YouTube videos. Guidance message, I'm not sure what that is, so I'm going to turn that off. No memory card warning, that's not going to be an issue because I'm going to turn off a setting in just a moment to make sure that never happens. Date and time, I guess could be useful if you put your camera to your eye and you see, oh, wait a moment, my camera has reset the date and time. Chances are maybe your battery's been out for a while and you'll be shooting everything on January 1st of the year the camera was manufactured in. So definitely useful to have in there. Battery level, another really good one to have in the viewfinder. Next menu is the button and dial settings. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do in this menu is to set the focus lever settings. Now, with the X-T5, we can set what happens when we push the lever in and also when we move it left, right, up, or down. And for me, I would like the movement to instantly move my focus points around because I use that quite a bit, and for a single push to allow me to edit the size of that focus point. Now, unfortunately, for some bizarre reason, Fujifilm has removed the ability to double tap that focus joystick to recenter the focus point. Now, hopefully that will return in a firmware update because that's something that I use dozens of times at every session. Now, as I mentioned before, I set my function buttons first and then allow any additional functions to spill over into the Q menu. So let's start with function buttons. I'm very simple in the way that I approach my sessions, so setting this up should make the camera very, very easy to use. Now, on the four-way selector, I'll have preview exposure in manual mode, shutter type, AF mode, and face detect, as these are the four things that I change most frequently, so they'll be right on my thumb. I use the preview exposure in manual mode setting primarily when I'm working with flash. So when it's turned on, I can see that I've got my ambient light level correct, which can sometimes actually be too dark for me to see through the viewfinder, so I can quickly switch it off once I've got my settings dialed in, and that gives me a preview of the scene where I can actually see what's going on, and I know that my ambient exposure is going to stay the same because I'll be working in manual mode. On the left arrow of the D-pad, I'm going to set shutter type. Now, this is a really useful setting for me when I'm working in extremely bright light with a lens like the 56mm f1.2, or when I'm shooting long exposures on a tripod. In the first instance, I can take my shutter speed all the way to the point where I can underexpose the sunlight at f1.2 when I'm using the electronic shutter. And in the second case, I know that if I switch to electronic shutter very quickly, I can eliminate any shutter shock that might happen during a long exposure. So being able to switch between that and mechanical shutter really, really quickly and easily is important to me on a shoot-to-shoot basis. The right arrow of my D-pad gets set to AF mode on all of my bodies, and this allows me to quickly switch between single point and zone focusing. Now I use AFS with a single point for subjects that are not moving, and AFC with zone for moving subjects in most of my work. So this makes it really quick and easy to switch between those two modes, as I can just go AFS, AFC on the front here, and then very quickly switch between single point and zone. And finally, I've got face detection on the down arrow. Now, this is used when I have just one person in the frame and I want to get pinpoint focus on their eyes. I've found that Fujifilm's face detection, even in the X-T5, while it can detect faces further away, is still fairly unreliable at times, and it can be quite cumbersome to switch between faces. So I like to be able to switch it on and off very easily, so that I can prevent it from starting to find, faces in trees and concrete walls and things like that. For the final two buttons on this camera, I've now got an extra one freed up, thanks to Fujifilm allowing me to have the 3D level on by default in the viewfinder, and I've thought long and hard about how I want to set these two buttons up, as it is a new thing from my X-T3 and my X-T4. And I've settled on having one to change my white balance, and the second one to punch in to check focus. Now, I know that you can punch in to check focus using the back dial as well here by pushing that in, but I've found that over time that dial does tend to get a little bit mushy, and so moving it onto this button here should allow me to, I guess, get a little bit more life out of that button. So, not really sure how these two things are going to work out, but I'll let you know how that goes in my review. Now that we're done there, I'll go back up to the quick menu and add any functions that I might use, once a week, but not at every session. After a little planning, I know that I'll only need a 4-tile quick menu, so let's jump into that. Now in here, I'll add image size and image quality for the times that I want to preview a change in ratio. Now, it still baffles me that Fujifilm requires us to record a JPEG in order to preview a different aspect ratio. My old Nikon cameras would just do a preview and then save a RAW file with that crop embedded as a flag that you could deal with in post-production later. And that seems like a far more efficient way to work to me, because I'm just going to discard those JPEG files when I get home anyway. The final thing that I'll have in here is my film simulation. Now, as I mentioned, I use Classic Chrome 99% of the time, but from time to time I will actually go in and change that for a specific scene. So it's nice to be able to get to it without having to dig into the menus. The more observant of you may have noticed that Fujifilm only gives you 3 customizable tiles in a 4-tile quick menu, and that's because, annoyingly in my opinion, they've decided to take the GFX 100S approach to the quick menu and force you to have a custom settings tile there. Now, this would be wonderful if I actually used their custom settings, but since I don't, I've basically just had a really useful tile taken away from me, and now I have to move my selection off that tile before beginning to use the quick menu every single time. Not so quick, in my opinion. Now, that one needs a fix, Fujifilm. At least give us the option. Continuing down the line, I'll turn the shoot without lens option on so that I can work with lenses like my Laowa 33mm f/0.95 that don't communicate with the body, and I'll also turn the shoot without card function off. Now, I'm not sure that anyone outside of shops putting demo models on the shelf actually use this function. Personally, I'd like to have the files that I shoot recorded to a card so that I can get them off the camera, but I don't know about you. Let me know in the comments. The final setting here for me is to go in and completely turn off the touchscreen. I just never use it, so it gets turned off whenever I get a new camera. Now, next we'll head down to the power management and turn the camera into boost mode. Now, I personally would rather have a camera that performs well than a battery that lasts a few minutes longer. I can always charge my batteries, but I can't get back moments, so I always have this in boost. I'm still not sure which EVF mode I'll end up using, given that we have all of these new options here, so I'll definitely report back on this in my review, but for now I'll leave it at the default of the 100 FPS setting. Right before I finish setting up the camera for good, I'll set the card slot setting to backup. Most of my photography is done for clients, so I like the peace of mind of knowing that I have 2 copies of everything immediately after I press the shutter button. Next, I'll set the file naming convention. Since I often work with 2 cameras, I want to make sure that the files from each camera are given unique names so that at any given job, I don't overwrite files from one camera or the other. So this camera will be X-T5A and the other will be X-T5B, and that ensures that the file names are unique and I never have that problem. Finally, I'll jump in and turn off geotagging. I don't really have any need for that in my work, as I know most of the time where I am. Now, perhaps I'll use it in some remote location when I'm traveling or something like that, but for now it can stay off. For me, the only thing needed in the new network and USB setting menu is to connect my phone to the camera, and that's already done. Everything else in here I will most likely never ever use. Okay, so I hope it's been useful for you to see how I go about setting up my X-T cameras and to hear the thought process behind each of the settings. And I hope that that's maybe given you some ideas for how you might want to set up your own cameras. Now, if you have any questions about the process or the settings that I made or the choices that I made, please do let me know in the comments below. Now, so far I've shot a handful of different sessions using these X-T5 cameras, and I've got about 15 or so more coming up in this month, so I should have a good set of thoughts that I can put into a review by the end of the next month. So please do get subscribed to see that. Thanks again for watching this one, and I will see you guys in the next video.